It was the kind of morning where the dust refused to settle, as if even the earth knew something needed resolving. The wind dragged silence through the village's wooden alleys, and each closed window seemed to hide more than protect. It was the kind of place where names carried weight, where when spoken they bore not just identity but history, and sometimes guilt. Not much was said there, but when it was, no one forgot, and so many chose silence. The auction was almost over when he arrived. He wasn't looking for anything, neither cattle nor tools nor company, but there was something in that place, in the dust suspended in the air, that held him captive, as if he were waiting for something he couldn't name. Perhaps it was the memory of what he never told his sister. Perhaps it was just guilt that, even without form, knows how to take root. He kept his distance. The men laughed loudly. The women measured everything with their eyes. And she was there in the corner, standing, dust on the hem of her dress, hands clasped in front of her body like someone holding something no one else could see. She didn't speak, she didn't look, she didn't beg. And that's why he saw her. That's exactly why he bought her. There was no hurry in the gesture, no visible emotion on his face. He simply took out the coins, handed them over, and extended his hand without speaking. She didn't hesitate. She walked beside him like someone who had walked through worse places, like someone who expects nothing, like someone who simply accepts. The world around them continued, noisy, unforgiving, the same, but inside him, something yielded. An invisible crack opened between what he was and what he didn't yet know he needed to remember. Already far from the commotion, near the fence where the horses grazed in silence, she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, it wasn't clear. It was like winter wind, almost fading, almost forgotten. But she said a name. And when she said the name no one else pronounced, the name of the sister he had buried not in the earth, but in silence, he stopped. The deed paper slipped from his hand. The horse beside him grew restless, and he froze, because she shouldn't know, because no one knew, because that name came from a place he never had the courage to return to. She remained motionless. She didn't repeat. She didn't explain. She just stood there. And in that instant, that exact instant, he understood. It wasn't him who had brought her home. It was she who had come to find what was left of him. She held the past he tried to bury with time. And now there was no pretending the dust had settled anymore. The house stood at the edge of the land, where the wind changed direction without warning, and animals listened better than men. It was small, made of tired wood, with a porch that creaked even without footsteps. He explained nothing when they arrived. He simply dismounted, untied his gear, and left the door open. She entered without asking, without fear, without haste. It was as if she already knew the way. Inside, everything seemed to be waiting for someone who wouldn't return. A lonely mug on the table, a poorly folded blanket on the armchair, and in the corner, a plate still with marks of dried food untouched for days. She didn't ask whose it was. She just looked and looked away, like someone who understands there are pains that aren't spoken, like someone who recognizes absences without needing to know their names. That first night, she didn't make the bed. She didn't touch the kitchen. She didn't touch the clothes folded in the closet. She walked to the barn, pushed the door, and heard the long creak of the hinge. It was there she began, the first repair. A loose pin, a board out of place, small things, silent. But it was in that gesture that she made herself present. Not a guest, nor a burden, but someone who listened to the place with her entire body. He watched from a distance. He didn't speak to her. He just left the coffee on the table at dawn, always in the same place, and she found it, always with calm eyes, as if she knew the gesture said more than any word. They didn't cross paths often, but there was a kind of mute code between them, a recognition that happened in small gestures, a respect without explanation. It was in the window's reflection that he saw, not directly, not clearly, but there, folding a sheet with firm hands, back curved the same way, she looked like, not her, but the sister, the one who disappeared without a trace. It was the way she adjusted the ends of the fabric, how she looked out without expecting anyone to return. As if saying without sound, I know you haven't forgotten, and he hadn't forgotten, never forgotten. In this second chapter, time didn't advance, it only deepened, because what hurt most wasn't what had been said, but all that remained unspoken. And she, with her eyes that never asked why, began to listen to that silence like someone listening to an old song, forgotten in the dust of the rooms. There was something in her steps that carried memory, not of places, but of losses. She walked like someone who had already buried promises, like someone who no longer believed in destiny, but still continued, day after day. It was hard to tell if that was courage or weariness. Perhaps it was both, mixed in the same gesture of continuing. She didn't touch the personal objects in the house. She didn't rummage through drawers. She didn't ask questions. But he noticed one afternoon that her boot was more worn on one side than the other, as if she had hidden something there for a long time. When she took off her shoes to wash them in the stream, he saw what fell out, a folded, half-torn envelope, its seal broken by time. He picked it up before the wind took it on impulse, not out of curiosity, but because something in that crooked handwriting froze his chest. It was his sister's name, written as if it were part of a lament. There was no sender, just the name, and inside a sheet with words erased from being folded so many times. He didn't show that he saw it. He just put it back in the same place, exactly as it was. But from then on, nothing was the same. His mind began to retrace routes that had already turned to dust. The mental maps of the years his sister disappeared. The last time he saw her, riding the horse with hard eyes and a silent mouth. No one knew where she went. They only knew that the sky closed in that day, and her trail was swallowed by a nameless storm. Now that woman, the woman without requests, without questions, without a known past, carried a piece of that unfinished end, and she didn't say it. She didn't hand it over. She just let time work on him. It was as if she knew that truths aren't thrown in someone's face. They need to mature in silence, germinate in guilt, explode slowly. On the porch, one night, he tried to ask, but the voice wouldn't come out. She was sitting, sewing something small, a handkerchief perhaps, her hands steady, her face calm, and he understood that no matter how much he wanted answers, it wasn't the time, because what she did the night his sister disappeared, it still didn't fit into words, and perhaps it would never be said, only felt. That dawn, he opened an old drawer and took out a letter he also never sent, addressed to his sister. He wrote it right after her disappearance, but never had the courage to burn it. He read it again, and when he finished, he just whispered, "You knew about her all along, didn't you?" The wind came through the window. The house didn't answer, but inside him, something began to remember, and that, alone, already hurt like a revelation. The flame started small, like everything that tries to warn before destroying. An acidic smell on the wind, the silence of the animals, the sky heavy with a red that wasn't sunset. When the barn burned, no one saw who lit the match, but everyone saw her, on her knees on the ground, crying without tears, her hands covered in soot, her eyes fixed on the horses trembling with fear, and that was enough for them to whisper what they had wanted to say for days. She brought bad luck. She is marked. This didn't happen before her. He heard everything. He heard without listening, because there was a fury inside him that didn't know where to land. It wasn't anger at her. It was anger at everything that had resurfaced. Anger at the lost years, the unanswered questions, his sister's name spoken by an unknown mouth. That stirred up what was buried, and when you dig without knowing where, sometimes you find your own fear. That night, he locked himself in his room and screamed, not at her, but at the mirror. The reflection returned the guilt he tried to hide, the guilt of not having looked harder, of having accepted her disappearance as fate, of having moved on without looking back. But the mirror doesn't forgive. It only reflects what was always there, waiting. While he was breaking apart inside, she did something strange. She picked up a burned photo, half of his sister's face still visible, the other half consumed by the ash of time. She wrapped it in a piece of linen and placed it under his horse's saddle. She didn't say anything. She didn't explain. But that gesture, it was everything. The next morning he found the bundle. He paused for a long time, and then he sat on the edge of the stable, his head in his hands, unable to mount or speak. She walked past him. She didn't touch him. She didn't look at him. She just walked to the fence, where the ashes of the fire still danced in the wind. She stood there, standing, silent. The fire took wood, but the cold that remained, that was old. It didn't start with her. It didn't start with the barn. It was the cold of absence, of shame, of what was never said. And now, burning or not, he understood. There were pains no fire could solve, but there were gestures, small, symbolic, that could begin to warm what remained. And she, with that linen cloth and silence, had just made the first one. There was no courthouse in the village, just a large dry fig tree where the elders made land agreements and marriages. It was there they gathered to decide about her. There was no official summons, no poster, just the whispers spread among church pews and bar counters. She's leaving today. She arrived unescorted because no one would dare touch her. She wore the same dress as always, clean but worn. She walked like someone who had already faced verdicts greater than the law of men. She stood straight before the faces that watched her as if they could undo her presence with their gazes. He came last, silent, with empty hands and shoulders full of memory. The judge was an old, hunched man who listened more than he spoke. They waited for him to read something, to ask questions, to begin the ritual of judgment, but he just looked at the faces before him and said, in a tone softer than the wind, "This here isn't justice. It's just another way for you to forget what you allowed to happen. No one answered, no one could. He then moved. He didn't speak. He didn't defend. He didn't explain. He simply took the deed paper from his pocket, the one that represented possession, power, inherited silence, and placed it at the judge's feet. Not to prove anything, but like someone releasing a chain. Then he turned and walked to her. He didn't extend his hand. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just stood beside her. And there, side by side, they said more than they could with words. There was no formal defense, there were no witnesses, but there was a broken man who didn't flee, there was a wounded woman who didn't lower her eyes, and there was an entire community forced to witness something they didn't understand. Dignity without a scream, choice without applause. In that place where women disappeared without a trace, where everyone pretended not to see, he chose to be seen, not out of courage, but out of weariness of pretending he didn't know. And in that silence, in his silence, she was heard for the first time, even without saying a single word. He found the box while cleaning the attic. He wasn't looking for anything, just trying to rid himself of the invisible weight that accumulates on planks and in corners, long untouched. It was covered by an embroidered cloth, kept with the care of someone who didn't know whether to forget or preserve. Inside, the green dress, folded delicately, the color still vibrant even after the years. It was his sister's, never worn, kept like a promise that time hadn't kept. He descended with it in his hands, hesitant. She was sitting on the porch, mending the hem of her own clothes. The sun gently touched her shoulders. He approached without saying anything and extended the dress. It was a simple gesture, but it carried everything he still hadn't managed to tell. She didn't take it. She just looked. Then she touched the fabric with her fingertips and said, with the firmest voice she had used since arriving, "It's not mine to wear." And then, with a calm that hurt, she stood up, went to the living room chair, and placed the dress over the backrest, like someone replying to an old letter. She didn't reject it. She didn't accept it. She just acknowledged it. He remained standing, motionless, feeling the air heavier than before. Because in that act, she showed him something he needed to see, that you don't replace someone who has left, that healing isn't forgetting, it's accepting the empty space without filling it by force. That same afternoon, a child passed through the gate, a neighbor's daughter, small with tangled hair. She saw the woman on the porch, stopped and said, "Good afternoon, madam," and she replied, not with shyness, not with surprise, but with naturalness. As if without realizing it, she was beginning to occupy a place she never asked for but perhaps deserved. He heard from the kitchen, and hearing the word "madam" said to that woman by a child who had never known her as anything but a presence, he understood. She wasn't his sister's shadow. She was an answer, a new chance not to fail with what could still be cared for. And this time, he didn't turn away. He didn't pretend not to hear. He just allowed himself to feel that perhaps his sister's absence was teaching him to embrace what had arrived, without replacing, without erasing, just continuing. That morning, the sound was different. There were no barks, no hammer against wood, only the sound of water boiling in the kettle and a light, almost imperceptible melody coming from her lips. A brief whistle, then a wordless murmur. He stopped at the door. He recognized the tune. It was the same song his sister hummed when sewing at dusk. It wasn't possible, and yet it was. He didn't interrupt her. He just stood there, his hand on the doorframe, as if asking permission to remember without pain. The kettle whistled. She turned off the stove and served the coffee with calm gestures, as if it had always been routine, and perhaps, deep down, it already was. Later, he brought the boards to fix the back fence. He didn't ask for help, but she appeared with gloves and a bucket of nails. They worked side by side in silence. The sound of the hammer on the wood, the creak of old wires being pulled, and then the gate, the same one that always creaked, was fixed with a simple piece of leather. And for the first time in years, it closed without a sound. It was just a gate, but it was also an end and a beginning. On the hill behind the barn, there was a nameless wooden cross. It was the place where he left flowers for his sister. He never told anyone. He never took anyone there. But that week, without warning, she appeared beside him, carrying wild flower seeds. They planted them together, a handful here, another there. He didn't say his sister's name. She didn't ask. But the flowers would grow there, with or without confession. Later, returning home, he left his hat on the living room chair. He never did that. He always hung it on the hook, as if guarding the place for someone who would return. But that night he left it there, and she saw. She didn't comment, but she pulled a blanket and covered the hat, as if understanding. Now he was coming back inside. Outside the wind still blew, but differently. It no longer rattled persistently. It just danced. On the fig tree branch, an old forgotten handkerchief detached from the beam and was carried upward, wrapping itself among the highest branches, as if it had finally found where it belonged. And it stayed, as if it had always been part of the tree, as if the wind, after so much knocking, had finally found where to stop.